Really happy for everyone to join us today, a really important webinar, particularly for our residential members. So obviously we'll be talking about the upcoming rental reform bills, and obviously there's a lot of complexity in the detail and a lot to talk about here today. I'm joined by Anna Bennett, who will be helping us talk through some of the key changes within and detail within the bill. So I can jump into the BPF perspective before we have the overview. This is really just to talk about what action the BPF has been taking in terms of lobbying and the outstanding issues within the bill. So obviously we saw the white paper come out what feels like a long time ago. And essentially the bill was carried through a lot of the key messages, changes and policy changes outlined in the initial white paper. So those are carried through into the bill and is very similar to what we initially expected. So therefore, a lot of our asks are also fairly similar in terms of the key things that we want to see changed within the bill. First and foremost, I think our fundamental, almost philosophical problem with the entire rental reform review and system is having the court system to match. So obviously the bill is seeking to address and ensure that there's more balance between tenants and landlords. However, this simply cannot be the case with the courts in the state that they are. So there's obviously existing challenges with being able to gain possession of property. We've had case studies from members where it can take up to a year to regain property, even within a Section 8 or a antisocial behaviour eviction. So we've made repeated demands on court reform and done a lot of lettering around that. I'll go into a little bit more detail later on about the specific action we've taken, but essentially it's been about keeping pressure on the Ministry of Justice and the court reform system there. We're still not really satisfied with the progress that's been made, and we have severe concerns in that area. So it's been an area that we've been pushing a lot on in our parliamentary engagement. Something that's a little bit more to do with the delivery of the reforms and something we've been working on sort of behind the scenes with DLUC advisors, etc., is improving the landlord registry or property portal. So it's something that we've been talking about and calling on from the BPF long before my time, I think since almost 2005, about some sort of register to weed out rogue landlords. And we just think the current design could go a little bit further to use for landlords to gain access to finance, for example, to have to provide their unique property reference number, for essentially the register to house all information and make it harder for rogue landlords to access the courts, etc., without being registered and having everything tied in and up to date and all verified and signed off. So we've been working behind the scenes to make sure that's enhanced. Alongside, but slightly separate to the rental reform, is our campaign to rein in to the wanton selective licensing. It's a perennial issue for our sector, and we've had lots of complaints from our members feeling that they aren't really getting the value out of selective licensing, and quite often it's a very high cost for a lot of our build to rent members who are paying hundreds of thousands because it's per unit and there's little discounts, whereas others there is some discounts and some areas build to rent have been able to get exemptions and cost reductions. So there's a big campaign here. The idea is that with the rental reform bill, we've got the new ombudsman, we've got the property register, we've got various other reforms that should improve the standard of the PRS up to the levels that selective licensing is looking for. So we're trying to make the argument with that coming in that there should be a scale back of selective licensing. A particular point is to try and negotiate an exemption for purpose-built student accommodation, as that was a recommendation from the government's review in 2019 into selective licensing that PBSA should be exempt. And we've been making that argument with parliamentarians and in a recent letter to the housing minister. So that was kind of our key ask in that area, and it's an ongoing, separate but tangential issue to the rental reforms. The other thing that's coming in, and Anna will talk a little bit more about this, but is the sort of mandatory redress or ombudsman coming in for the PRS. And we just need to maintain and ensure that that is priced appropriately. And we've had signals and support from the department that and reassurances that it will be competitively priced and similar to current levels. And a lot of our members are already part of the voluntary redress system. So yeah, that's just a point to maintain and work on. A final but really vital area, and one that I hope will get traction with parliamentarians, is working on getting towards a 6-month notice period. So as the bill is currently written, there's essentially a tenant can enter the property, enter a rental agreement, a periodic tenancy, and then leave just 2 months later. So we have concerns that this could lead to a short-term let scenario, and I think this goes completely against what the government's trying to do. They're trying to encourage long-term homes and communities rather than a transient community that is often a challenge of the PRS. So I think that's something our members want as well. We want to provide long-term secure housing, long-term secure tenures. Obviously, many of our members have offered long-term leases and try and encourage some sense of permanency amongst their customers. So we are pushing for a 4-month at the start of tenancies, a 4-month plus 2 months, up to a total of 6 months notice period for renters when they first enter their periodic tenancy. I think this is something we'll look to do to engage with parliamentarians. I think hopefully we can gain some traction there, as it is there's obviously quite a pushback against the likes of Airbnb and other short-term lets upsetting rental prices, etc. So yeah, we're making representations on that. Just some examples of our recent engagement. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, which I can't go into too much detail here, but we did recently attend a roundtable with other landlord groups, such as the NRLA and several others, with Michael Gove, where we fed back our concerns, and yeah, we were quite effective in. We particularly honed in on court reform as a key part of the rental reforms. We recently lettered and gained a response from Rachel McLean on selective licensing and how that might function going forward, and looking to gain some reassurances on that. Obviously a while back now, but I think a really useful first step to get it in writing, and a lot of our requests and our policy requests were included in the LUHC Select Committee's report, which we're still awaiting. I haven't checked this morning, but still awaiting the government's response to. So the committee agreed with the 6-month lock-in at the start. It agreed with the maintenance of rental review clauses and various other aspects. So we got that on record, and we're using that as a lobbying tool there. We are working with other groups. Obviously, the NRLA are keenly interested and involved. We've done some joint lettering with them to parliamentarians and Secretary of State, and we've also are looking more on the PBSA student accommodation side with Unipol and specific aspects relating to that. We've also done our own lettering campaigns to the LUHC Select Committee Chair, Clive Betts, and are looking to engage and meet with him. Our work with parliamentarians has also kicked off as soon as the bill came out. We've submitted several briefings and had meetings with various parliamentarians on potential amendments and raising our concerns. And we're also looking to do some media work potentially on selective licensing or around how rental review clauses could work. And finally, we created a briefing and are waiting for a second reading to launch the sort of next wave of collateral to really iron out our key asks. As I mentioned, we are sort of in a bit of a state of limbo, waiting for the second reading. We did expect it before summer recess, so it could be any time now, but if not, it will be pushed back after the recess into September. So as is the case, because we're still waiting for the second reading, we are looking to deliver some amendments, but we're just looking for sponsors and finalising the wording of those. And whilst there's a slight lull before the storm, we are working on our engagement on selective licensing, ensuring that ministers are briefed on that and understand the challenges there. And thank you to those members that contributed to our call to evidence that we pulled together last year. So that's about everything in terms of the BPF's engagement. There's still some ongoing discussions, and I'm happy to field questions at the end, but I'll try and pass back to Anna now.
I'm Anna Bennett. I'm a partner at Devonshire Solicitors. We act mainly for social landlords, but we do also work for private landlords. And across the board, really, this will affect our clients a lot in terms of the tenure that will be affected that they offer now. But we're used to working with grounds, and obviously Section 21 and the abolition of Section 21 is a concern across the sector, across the social landlord sector, and of course for private landlords who are very much used to the Section 21 procedure and having that no-fault ground to rely on, and maybe feeling slightly daunted by the grounds. Also, the changes in terms of fixed terms can be a major impact on our clients, and also private landlords who are used to offering 2-year or 1 year or whatever it is, that certainty of term both for them and for tenants, and that will be come away basically if the act or if the bill comes in as it is currently envisaged. It's important to stress that it has stressed already, but it is a bill only, so it's still awaiting the second reading. There could be further changes. I wouldn't anticipate huge changes. I would imagine Section 21 will be abolished. I would imagine, because it's very popular, but there will be changes, no doubt, as it goes through Parliament. Another thing just to mention from the legal side, this is for England only. Wales obviously had major transformation in its tenancy and tenure regime last year in terms of occupation contracts coming into place. So this is for English law only. Okay, so quick canter through what we're going to talk about. We're going to discuss the abolition of fixed term tenancies. We're going to discuss the changes to rent increases, the removal of contractual clauses. We're going to talk about pets, tenant notice to quits. We're going to talk about the tenancy deposit requirements. We're going to talk about changes to the grounds of possession, the existing Section 8 grounds. We're going to talk about basically all the duties that will be expected of you as a landlord that should be coming in, and also a bit about transitional provisions, because you will have tenants who will be impacted, but there will be a period probably of about a year before the changes affect them. Then we're going to talk about the slightly scary sounding financial penalties, offences and enforcement, how that's all going to happen. We'll talk about landlord redress, which is the ombudsman type scheme, and the database, property portal, private rented sector database, and enforcement of that. Okay, so one of the biggest changes, and this is really something that's quite seismic. Landlord and tenant law, Housing Act laws changed so much since the 1980s, and this is bringing us basically straight back to the 1980s in a way. But essentially, there is a new section 4A being inserted into the existing Housing Act 1988. And this will mean that it's no longer possible to have fixed term tenancies. All assured tenancies essentially have to be periodic, with a rent period of not more than 28 days or 1 month. So essentially, you're going to end up with weekly or monthly periodic tenancies. Can call them lifetime tenancies, I suppose, but that they are essentially periodic tenancies rather than fixed term. So essentially, if your tenancy was already fixed term tenancy, then the tenancy period will reflect the rental period. So there's quite a complicated formulation of how you work it out, but basically anything over a month, the tenancy will be treated as being monthly beginning on the first date of the tenancy. And there's a whole formula set out within the Housing Act of how to work out what the rent will be if it was for a longer period previously, and it should be due on the first date of the period. Now, rent increases. This is quite a major change. Section 13 exists already. Some of our clients use it anyway. It is the default. If there's no rent increase clause in your tenancy agreements, then Section 13 rent increase will apply. The way you do it at the moment is via a prescribed form. It's quite complicated already because you have to find the first date after a certain date when it came into force, which is 2005, and then you try and work it out from there when these rent increase should be applied from. So it's all a bit difficult every year when we have to go and look at these rent increases, and it does impact our clients already. So the proposed changes mean that this will impact private landlords because essentially contractual rental clause increases are no longer an option. Everything will have to be done by the Section 13 procedure. There will be a new prescribed form. Landlords will have to get 2 months' notice rather than 1, which is the existing regime, and there has to be at least 52 weeks between increases, give or take a week, essentially, it's currently worded. But it should mean that all private tenancies will be subject to yearly increases rather than increasing as per contractual clauses. I'm going to go back actually. So obviously this is going to have a major impact if you're used to relying on contractual clauses and having to rely on this new system. In terms of what it means, you can only increase yearly. Your tenants can challenge this. They could go to the first tier tribunal if they think that the rent has been increased unfairly. The first tier tribunal will only look at whether it's over market rent. So all they will assess is whether the tenancy or the premises and the rent that you're charging is in line with market rent. So they will look at the property, they'll look at the rents in the area, they'll look at the condition of the property, if there's any issues with repairs and so on, but they will basically apply the market rent. So there is a slight risk to tenants if they challenge that they could end up with a figure higher than they're actually being charged, but both you and the tenant can then agree a lower rate if you decide to do so. Pets, this is a very politically attractive thing to have in, so it's in there because there was a lot of concern about pets, if you'll remember, especially around lockdown, people being really concerned they weren't allowed to keep pets and you know, the support animals and so on. So essentially the proposal is that there's going to be a section 16A included and inserted into the Housing Act 1988, which will imply a term. So if there's nothing in there, there's an implied term that tenants can request a pet and that you can't unreasonably refuse the same as a private landlord. There'll be all sorts of time frames put into place in terms of how quickly you have to respond and so on. The tenants have to put in their request in writing. You have to give a description of what the pet is. If you choose to refuse, then you have to give good reasons. If you don't do so, then the court may order specific performance, i.e. they be allowed to have their pet. On the flip side of that, landlords are allowed to basically ask that their tenants take out insurance, some kind of indemnity insurance to cover in case of any destruction by the pets. or alternatively, they can take out insurance themselves for the pets and then charge the tenants. And this is excluded from the ban under the Tenant Fees Act. So essentially, you will be able to charge if that is the case. Now, the notice to quit from tenants, this Theo mentioned earlier, essentially they are going to amend the Protection from Eviction Act, which is quite an old act. It's 1977. So in housing terms, it's one of the older ones. But basically, for assured tenants, they must give 2 months' notice in writing, or they can give 2 months' notice in writing to surrender up their tenancy, unless you are prepared to agree. So essentially, if you're prepared to agree, you're happy that they go, you've got someone in lined up, then they can give a shorter period if you're happy to accept that. But they must give that 2 months' notice. For other types of tenure, such as contractual tenancies or licenses, then it's still 4 weeks. They must give 4 weeks' notice. And it may be withdrawn. So this is new. Notice to quit never used to be able to essentially withdraw them, although in practice, obviously, you might withdraw them if neither party chose to act on it. If both parties agree, if your tenant changes his mind, you're quite happy for them to stay, then they can withdraw that notice to quit. Okay, so for tenancy deposit requirements, as you probably are well aware, if you don't protect your tenancy deposit now, you can't rely on Section 21 notices, you can't go down the accelerated route. This is going to be extended to cover assured tenancies as well. So essentially, you won't be able to seek possession or get a possession order unless you've protected the deposit, or unless you have repaid it in full, or repaid it subject to any deductions agreed between you and the tenant. The only exception to that is if you are seeking possession on ground 7A or ground 14, which are the nuisance grounds, which I will come on to quite shortly. Okay, so there are changes which I'm going to come on to now in terms of the existing grounds for possession under Schedule 2 of the Housing Act 1988. If you've ever looked at Schedule 2 of the Housing Act 1988, it's laid out fairly straightforwardly. There's lots of different grounds you can rely on currently. So I am going to talk about those ones that still exist and won't be changed as well initially, and then I'll talk about new ones that will be brought in to hopefully alleviate some concerns and to try and address the fact that Section 21 is going to be abolished and you can't rely on it anymore, so that no-fault ground will fall away. Okay, so there'll be a new statutory form of notice. There's currently a statutory form of notice. It's in a prescribed form, which you can look at now. I would imagine it won't change substantially from that, but it will have new prescribed information to reflect the changes, i.e. the new grounds will be put in with their notice periods and so on. Everything will be changed and amended in accordance with Schedule. So all of the grounds you can find now, if you look in the Renters Reform Bill, it's all under Schedule 1, the proposed changes. There's going to be new mandatory and new discretionary grounds. Lots of these are actually aimed at the social housing sector, because things like supported accommodation, for example, traditionally used short hold tenancies and no-fault grounds, where they have tenants who might be less reliable and where they might need to get possession more quickly. They would use Section 21, but they won't be able to do that. So there's a lot of new grounds you'll see, especially under ground 5. But those are only in relation to private registered providers and not private landlords. So grounds that won't change and are worth bearing in mind are ground 7A, which is conviction of a serious offence or breach of some kind of community order, injunction. Ground 8 it will change slightly, but it's not going to change in terms of the fact that you can still get mandatory possession if you can show that a tenant is 2 months arrears in rent or in arrears of rent at the date you serve the notice and also at the date of hearing. There will be a change. I have got a slide, but basically it's in relation to universal credit and any changes there. Grounds 10 and 11, which are your fallback grounds essentially for rent claims, where some rent's unpaid or persistent delays in paying rent. So if there aren't any rent arrears at the date of the first hearing, you can say, well, ground 11 still applies, and you want the judge to consider that. Ground 12 is breach of tenancy. Any term in the tenancy agreement that has been breached, that's no change there. Ground 30 is quite useful sometimes if there's tenant waste, i.e. if they've damaged the property, fixtures, fittings, or things like hoarding potentially. If you have those kind of cases, they might come under tenant waste also, and damage to furniture, which may come up more often in the private sector. So there are some changes, however. So ground 1 is where the landlord wishes to move into the dwelling or sell the property. So now the change here is, it already exists, but if the landlord, if you want to rely on that, then the landlord has to provide notice to the tenant before the commencement of the tenancy that the landlord will wish to seek possession on that ground, or that so that she or the spouse might want to occupy as their own principal home later. So before you let out your property, you need to say, if this may apply, you need to let the tenant know at that point. And this will tie in with the duties that I'll come on to after I've talked about grounds. So the notice can't be served before 6 months after the tenancy is commenced, except if there's a compulsory purchase order in place. It can be occupation by the landlord or a family member, and there's a list of who would constitute a family member under the proposed grounds. Further, so this ties into duties and offences. Following that 6 months, the landlord cannot let or advertise or sell for at least 3 months after obtaining possession of the property. So after the tenant gives up the possession of the property, the landlord can't then go on to actually advertise to sell the property. A change to ground 2, which is the mortgagee grounds. The only change here is that you can get the mortgage after the tenancy started. So if you've had change in mortgage provider, then that's fine, you're still covered. You can still use ground 2, and it's a mandatory ground. Now, I'm mentioning this just because there has been concern about student accommodation, to say that this doesn't apply to private landlords. This is only for purpose-built student accommodation. I have seen press, I've seen Michael Gove saying he's going to look at it again in terms of student accommodation, but this ground won't be the way they do it. They will probably look at some kind of exception in terms of how the property is let out, i.e. exempted from the short tenancy regime in total, potentially, but at the moment there's no proposals to do that in the current drafting of the bill. Quickly jog over these. There was a ground for ground 3 for holiday lets. That's been abolished. That's trying to move away from people letting out their property or trying to get possession to then let it out on a more lucrative basis during the holiday season. Ground 5 probably won't apply, but it's more about ministers of religion and looking for possession. And again, they'd have to give notice before the tenancy commence that they want to run on those grounds. Again, both of those are mandatory, or that ground 5 is mandatory. Now, ground 6A, this is about enforcement action. So if you are a landlord and there's some kind of breach of licensing, or there's some kind of hazard in the property, and you have been notified by the local housing authority, then they might require vacant possession because they might decide it's not safe to live in. You might be subject to a banning order. Well, I hope you won't, but landlords who are, they won't be allowed to let the property, so they would then have to seek possession on ground 6A to comply with the banning order. Similarly, if it was a house of multiple occupation and the license had been refused or revoked, again, the landlord should seek possession on ground 6A to get the property vacated, so that they can then do what they need to do to either sell the property or put things right before they let it out again. So ground 8 I mentioned, it still exists. There is a slight change that essentially the government recognised that some debt might be due to benefits not being paid, universal not being paid, and if that debt is due to that, due to universal credit or benefit issues, then they can't be evicted, they can't be enforced, you can't enforce on that basis. Now, ground 8A is potentially quite exciting. So this is a new ground, and this is where tenants are in arrears of more than 2 months or 8 weeks on at least 3 separate days in a period of 3 years before service of a notice. So this is for those tenants who let their arrears accrue, pay them off just before a hearing, and then start letting them accrue. So this is to aim to get or to ally landlords concerned about those tenants who they don't pay the rent sufficiently. So that should be a new mandatory ground. It's attracted a lot of controversy. This is one of the ones that the tenants' lawyers are most up in arms about. Tenant pressure groups are concerned about this ground, so that there may be amends potentially on this one. But at the moment, that is the way it's worded. Essentially, 3-year period, arrears of over 2 months, and any 3 separate days in that period, and it should give rise to a mandatory ground for possession, which essentially means you take your claim to court, you go on ground A, you can show those 3 days, and in theory, at least, the judge has no discretion. They should give you your possession order. Ground 14, now this was mooted as some amazing change, but actually it's just the language essentially that's changed here. So where they talk about nuisance grounds and tenants have done something that's capable of causing or rather likely to cause nuisance and annoyance to others, it's just become capable of causing nuisance or annoyance. So essentially, not really much change. It does tie in with the wording under the Antisocial Behaviour Crime Policing Act and injunction. So I suspect that might be why they've made the changes. But in reality, it doesn't really make that much difference to ground 14. Now, it's a slightly funny situation, as in ground 14 as it currently stands. You can serve notice and you can apply to court the next day. Notice period is immediate, so you serve it and you can actually just issue straight away. They've changed that, so you have to give 2 weeks notice. However, they've said that you can apply for possession within that period, as in you can issue the claim within that period. So you can apply for possession straight away, but you can't get a possession order. But I mean, it's a bit of anyone who's worked with the courts and tried to get any kind of court order, put it this way, you're not going to get a hearing within 2 weeks. So it's a bit of a nonsense ground, really, that's aimed presumably to comfort tenants groups, but essentially in reality is not going to make much difference in terms of what happens on the ground, as a lot of this will be subject to the resourcing of the courts. I'm going to come on to talk about duties and offences and the enforcement of those duties and what this means for you as landlords. Okay, so Section 9 of the Rent Reform Bill is going to insert a new Section 16D of the Housing Act 1988. And this is the duty that I've spoken about in terms of giving a statement of terms and other information before the start of any new tenancy. So before the start of any tenancy, any kind of landlord of an assured tenancy has to give the tenant a written statement of the terms of the tenancy as specified, either an agreement in writing or a record of the terms agreed. This shouldn't be too problematic because you'll have your terms and conditions attached to your tenancy anyway. There's certain grounds, if you want to rely on them, then you have to give notice. These are all actually essentially landlord grounds, registered provider grounds, so they're probably nothing that you need to think about in terms of the grounds you need to rely upon, apart from grounds that you might want to go in and take possession. So, if you wanted to sell the property, that would be a ground you'd need to put in. But the other grounds essentially are grounds for RPs and any other information. So essentially, the Secretary of State will be drafting up some prescribed information, which you will have to give to your tenants before they sign up to a tenancy with you. There's other duties as well. So essentially, you can't purport to let the tenancy for a fixed term period. You can't say, here's a 2-year fixed term tenancy. That is a breach of your duty. You can't purport to end the tenancy by service of a notice to quit. I mean, you couldn't do this essentially now. You wouldn't. I mean, you could try, but you wouldn't be successful if you were to go to court. But certainly, if you were to do that, and the tenant then left, then that could be a problem, could be an offence. You can't serve a notice purporting to be a Section 8 notice, but not in the correct form. So As a duty, you have to serve the correct prescribed notice. You can't serve a notice on any ground the landlord's not entitled to rely upon. If the tenant surrenders up the tenancy after receiving such a notice, and actually you've put in grounds that you're not entitled to rely upon, so any of those grounds, for example, that are reserved for registered social providers, then potentially that's an offence which could be enforced against you. And again, serve any kind of notice where you've not served a notice prior to a statement of terms prior to the tenancy starting. You can't serve a Section 8 notice specifying one or more of grounds 1, 1A and 6, which specifies a date earlier than 6 months as the earliest date on which the possession proceedings would start. So you can't serve any notice without the proper expiry date. Again, if the tenant gives up possession as a result, so if they surrender back possession, then potentially this could be an offence under Section 16G, which I'll come on to. Again, if you have obtained possession, i.e. your tenant surrendered up possession after serving a notice, and you then were to let the property out or authorised a lettings agency to do so, or to market the property in any way within that 3-month period, then that is another duty that you would have breached potentially. So you have a duty not to let it out again within that 3-month period. Again, just to be clear, this means where the tenant surrendered up possession rather than you've gone to court, obtained a possession order, enforced it. It means where the tenant surrendered up upon receiving the notice and taking it in good faith. So again, if you contravene that offence, then it's an offence under Section 16G. Just a quick mention for your existing tenants. Obviously, they will already have tenancies that start or are in place when the Act comes into force. So the duty to give a statement of terms or the prohibition on serving a notice of the statement of terms not given doesn't apply to existing tenants with the written tenancy agreements. However, you will have a transitional period where you have to give those existing tenants information in writing about the changes that's going to be made and how it applies to their tenancy agreement. It's probably going to be in some kind of prescribed form. If you look at what happened in Wales, there was a year-long transitional period, and that was what was kind of mooted in the white paper. So I suspect any period will be around a year to start the year after the Renters Reform Act is enacted and affects your new tenants. In terms of enforcement and the bodies that are going to be enforcing this, it will be the local housing authority. The local housing authority is currently the body that's responsible for monitoring HMO licenses, for example. So it's expanding their remit essentially. There's all sorts of, there's quite a lot of detail essentially of what happens if a local housing authority decides to take action against a property that's not within its own area, i.e. it needs to notify the local housing authority which area it is concerned about, if it's going to take that action. If it chooses not to, then it needs to notify that it's not taking action, and so on, so you avoid basically double prosecution. There's also provision, because essentially there's about 300 local housing authorities that this will affect. So to try and ensure consistency of how these these duties are enforced and how the prosecution happens or financial penalties are applied, there should be a lead enforcement authority put into place. So that it could be either one relevant authority for a particular area, or a number of local housing authorities. A nominated one might be nominated for certain areas, and they will be the lead enforcement agency responsible for overseeing how the local housing authorities work. And the idea is they'll issue guidance, and if necessary, they can take any steps necessary to actually prosecute any kind of offences themselves, if it's quicker to do that themselves rather than passing it back to the local housing authority. Okay, and to fund all of this, the local housing authority have allowed or will be allowed essentially to impose financial penalties on any landlord if they are satisfied beyond reasonable doubt, it's the criminal burden of doubt, that landlord contravened section 16D, 16E2, either serving notice on the incorrect grounds, or where the tenancy surrendered the tenancy, or for example, where you've then marketed the property after you've served the ground one notice, for example. If you do any of those things, then the local housing authority, rather than prosecuting you and going through the Max Court, they can decide, if they're happy, they've got enough proof beyond reasonable doubt, they can decide to impose a financial penalty upon you, and that should be not more than £5,000. If the breach then continues for a further 28 days, or if there's within a 5-year period there's another offence, then they can impose a further penalty, which is quite substantial, and I'll come on to. They can't impose any kind of financial penalty, essentially, if criminal proceedings are underway, if the matter is in the magistrate's court, to avoid essentially punishing landlords twice. Offences. So this is where it's an offence. It can be punishable by going to the magistrate's court, or however they want to enforce it. But basically, if a landlord would be guilty of offence if they serve a notice or purported notice, specifying a ground they're not entitled to rely upon knowingly or recklessly, or if serving notice on grounds 1, 1A or 6 and giving less than 6 months notice, and the tenant surrenders the tenancy as a result, that is an offence. There'll be further offences, essentially, if any of those duties are breached, or if it continues, or there's more than one breach sort of within a 5-year period, then essentially that would be a section 16G offence, and landlords can be fined a penalty of not more than £30,000, so quite a substantial sum. It can't be used again if the person's convicted of offence or criminal proceedings have started, or the landlord wasn't convicted, essentially, after the criminal proceedings were put into place. I mean, the benefit as well of the financial penalties is the local housing authority will keep those fees, and they will be help to actually fund them, because one of the concerns raised by the local housing authorities and the enforcement officers is this is all well and good, but we're stretched already. We don't have time to do the enforcement we're supposed to be doing currently, so how are we going to pay for this? So I think the idea is that these fines will help fund the local housing authority's duties in this regard in terms of enforcement. In terms of what happens, there will no doubt be detailed regulations after the Act comes into place, but the way it's envisaged to happen is there'll be sort of a stepped process. Firstly, the local housing authority will send a notice of intent with a notice, giving the date of the notice, how much they propose to impose a financial penalty of, the reasons the financial penalty is being imposed on the notice being served on them, and information about who to make written representations to, and that they have 28 days to do it. So they'll be invited to write back to the local housing authority if they have any reasons to say, actually, I'm not guilty here, that you've got this wrong, or whatever the reasons are. At the end of that period, if there's been any representations or otherwise, then the local housing authority has to decide whether to impose the notice. If so, then they serve a fine or notice giving 28 days pay. At that point, if it wants to, the landlord can appeal to the first tier tribunal within 28 days of receipt of the final notice. Financial penalties is quite useful. They can be recovered by the local housing authority as if payable by a county court judgment. This means they can get, say, charging orders, attachment of earnings orders, third-party freezing orders on your bank account, so they can enforce those financial penalties and make sure they actually get paid if the landlord doesn't voluntarily pay the penalties. Okay, so moving on to the landlord redress scheme, which is separate to the local housing authority. This will be essentially an ombudsman for private landlords. There is already a housing ombudsman that exists for the for the registered social landlords, essentially. So that's the housing ombudsman, but this would be specifically for private landlords. It's not for social landlords. It's all the way it's drafted is basically allowing the Secretary of State to make any regulations it needs to ensure that an ombudsman is appointed or the landlord redress scheme is put into place. The point is to oversee and monitor complaints about non-compliance with the types of complaints to be determined, but certainly the vision is to try and shift disputes away from the county courts and allow them to be dealt with more quickly. They will have the power to issue apologies, to ask the landlord to issue apologies. They won't be apologising. Get the landlord to provide information to tenants, ask the landlord to take remedial action, for example, in some kind of disrepair dispute, and potentially pay compensation of up to £25,000. Landlords will be required to join the approved redress scheme. I think Theo's already talked about pressure being put to make sure it's not too onerous. If the landlord doesn't join the landlord redress scheme, then the local housing authority can prosecute or serve a fixed penalty notice. And the regulations may well require somebody to be a member of the landlord redress scheme before they are able to market any dwelling. Again, financial penalties are £5,000 for not being a member, but up to £30,000 for repeated breaches of the regulations. And again, those penalties can be enforceable as though they were a county court judgment. And the property portal, I've actually got a few slides on the property portal, I don't know why, but it's taken up a bit of my space here, but essentially I will go through them quite quickly. It has been discussed, it's all to be determined by regulation, there's not much detail in there. Whoever or whichever body ends up operating the database will have to ensure that there's facilities available for those who can't use computer devices. It will have to ensure that the local housing authority can edit the database to add details where they need to. It will need to ensure that facilities are available to report breaches to be basically recorded onto the portal and then reported back. It needs to publish advice and information about how rights and obligations for both landlords and tenants. The importance is that you, as landlords, the proposal is you won't be able to market any dwelling for rent unless there's an active landlord entry in the dwelling in the database for the landlord, or an active dwelling entry. So they'll have these unique identified codes for both dwelling and landlord, which will then be in the portal. And the idea is that tenants can go, use their phone, take a snapshot for any advert, and there should be a unique identification code for you as the landlord and your dwelling, and just to see if there have been any previous issues they should be aware of before they go and view that property and agree to a tenancy. And the duty is on you as the landlord to make sure all of the information is up to date, all the requirements are complied with. The local housing authority can put in entries if landlords are convicted of banning orders or any kind of offence has been committed. It should be recorded within there. And again, the local housing authority will have a duty to make sure the property portal or database is kept up to date. Again, it's the same figures essentially. If landlords are found to be marketing, advertising or letting any dwellings which aren't registered on the database, or any kind of offences, i.e. putting in false information, then they can be fined up to £5,000. And again, for repeated continued breaches, it's up to £30,000. Got a question. Does the abolition of contractual rent increase clauses apply to the persisting tenancies at the date the Renters Reform Act comes into force? Is anyone assessed whether the FTT has capacity to deal with all of the rent increase disputes that will go before it? I'm not sure whether anyone's assessed the FTT's capabilities, or indeed the court's capabilities of having to deal with lots of cases on grounds rather than using the accelerated route. However, I believe that there will be a transitional period of a year. So I'm not sure in terms of the contractual rent increase clauses whether they will apply. I don't see why they wouldn't. I think there must be a transitional period in terms of the statement of terms, but I think the assumption must be that it may well apply, but watch this space really in terms of what's going to happen as it goes through the Parliament.
We have been in touch with the First Tier Tribunal and the court system just to try and understand how they're gearing up for that. I think the First Tier Tribunal has been quite a bit blindsided by the initial white paper announcement and are trying to gear up to deal with it. Anna, you mentioned obviously the transition period. I think that will be kind of key for them to try and get ready for it. But yeah, it is an obvious concern of ours that almost all rent increases could go through the First Tier Tribunal if necessary. So yeah, definitely a major concern of us, the amount of pressure the courts will be under.
Another question: if tenants have been in the property for a few years and then the landlord needs to move into the property and make it their main home, how would they do that? Can they apply for possession for that? There is a new ground. For existing tenants, there's these transitional periods. So there's going to be some kind of form, I imagine, that the government will put into place where you have to serve a statement of terms. And I would imagine that if you've got existing tenants who've been there for a while, that if you did then want to rely on the ground to move back into the property, then it will be included within that notice, that statement of terms, that you'll be saying, I might be wanting to rely on this within the near future. Okay, new ground 8A. You say it's on 3 separate days. What makes the days separate? Oh, from my reading of the bill, the days would only be separate if there's a reduction in the amount owed between each day. Yes, I think that has to be right. So it may be a period where the arrears are over 2 months. So it doesn't have to just be a day. It could be like a couple of months. But I think if it then goes down, but then comes back up again, and then the first date that happens to the last date, and then it goes down, I think that must be the answer between those 3 periods. I don't think it has to be days, and that obviously in practice that's really unlikely, that it would only dip in for a day and then come back down again. It will probably be longer periods, but as long as you could show there's 3 periods within the 3 years, then potentially that could give rise to ground 8A. If tenants consistently pay rent, so they're just shy of the 2 months required by legislation, what can be done? Well, you've got grounds 10 and 11 that you can rely on, existing grounds 10 and 11, which are that rent is unpaid and that there's persistent delays in paying rent. So if you can show that, then it's discretionary, it's for the court to decide. But obviously if it's causing you financial difficulties, then that's something you should be raising at court. And obviously the court has the duty to balance your rights as well, and consider your rights and the impact on you of those late payments, or how it's impacting on you. So that's something to raise. So as I say, it's discretionary. There are grounds that apply and you can use now, but it would be a case of you having to explain to the court why it's significant and why they are impacting on you as a landlord. What sort of reasons can a landlord raise in objecting to a pet? I've only seen a superior lease preventing pets as an example. Will there be further guidance? There may be further guidance. I think it's one of those things that's subjective. Obviously, a pet horse will be, you could probably raise objections a lot more easily than a pet goldfish. So it really depends on the type of animal that they're proposing to bring in. And ultimately it's a common sense approach, as it were, as much as there is common sense in these cases. We don't have any details on the landlord registration fees at the moment. Theo, do you have any detail on that?
Sorry, in terms of the pricing, etc.
Yeah,
so we did have some meetings with the team in charge of the property portal. I believe they made some overtures about it being per landlord rather than per property, so good news for our build to rent members. But yeah, we are pushing for that fee to kind of be per member rather than across multiple properties. But I can raise another inquiry to see where that's ended up. There's still a little bit of detail to come about exactly how much it all costs, but I believe it will be proportionate. There was an interesting one I can read out for you, just around PBSA.
right.
For purpose-built student accommodation, you briefly mentioned it, but how does the rental reform bill impact PBSA more widely? Does the revised ground 8, for example, apply to PBSA, and will the database and landlord registration also apply to PBSA?
I'm not sure about the second question in terms of whether the PRS data, so I wouldn't imagine it will. I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I think you could probably rely on the other grounds. Ground 4 definitely will apply for PBSA, but obviously the other grounds may well apply also. But I don't know about the database. That'd be interesting, and the landlord redress scheme, but then I can't see why not. But PBSA are generally the sort of educational facilities letting out properties. So I'm not quite sure where they would fit. I'd have to read the guidance more closely, I think.
We're still doing a bit of digging in terms of PBSA. We do have a Unipol are working on a roundtable with the Secretary of State just to clarify a few things. And yeah, I can try and gather up some more information on that. But yeah, largely I think a lot of that will be covered by the codes. So we're hoping that will act as the first step, first database, and will instead supersede some of the legislation coming through the Rental Reform Act. So I think that's all we've got time for today. There's some more questions in chat which I'll gather up and do some replies to, but thank you so much, Anna, for joining us. Really useful and important discussion, and we'll be raising a series of more discussions on this as the bill passes through Parliament. And we'll also be close to the time, perhaps during the transition period, we can have another look at to see where it's got to. So thank you all for joining us today. And please, any questions, I can share my contact details, and we're happy to share the PowerPoint. Is that right, Anna, as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
okay, great.
Absolutely.
For any colleagues that have missed the webinar today, you will be able to watch it back on YouTube, and that will be uploaded to our channel in sometime in the next week. So just to say thank you again, Anna, and I look forward to talking about this again soon.